Hi, I'm Dave, DIYCave, and I'm here with Dean. And today we're going to be going over our safety introduction and certification for the SawStop table saw that we have here at the cave. We have quite a few tools here that do require certification, and we spend a lot of time going through those pieces of equipment, and these videos are being made to help us shorten that process and to give people some information to look back on if they need a refresher or have some questions. What we're going to go through today are how the saw works, how to make some basic cuts, and how to stay safe while you're using it. Okay. So here are some basic safety instructions or tips, and we do also have these posted on the wall in case you need a refresher. One of the most important things when you're using the table saw or the other pieces of equipment in the wood shop that have spinning blades or knives is no gloves. And there are a couple of reasons for that, and one would be tactile. If you have gloves on, you can't really feel as much of what's going on, and also a lot of gloves are fairly loose. Yeah. So they're not skin tight, and they may run the risk of a loose thread or a loose part of the glove being pulled into the blade. And you won't have time to react. And like the gloves, no loose clothing or dangling items. A lot of times now that it's cold out, you have a long sleeve shirt on, so make sure the cuffs are nice and tight, or like we both have, roll them up above your elbows, and make sure if you have a loose tails at the bottom to tuck your shirt in. One of the things that I always do, which I notice you have done as well, I wear a lot of hoodies. The first thing I do is get rid of that string. Cut it off, get rid of it, because I don't want it dangling around the saw blade. Definitely want to make sure you wear proper eye and hearing protection, as well as a dust mask. There is a lot of debris that flies off of the saw, and a lot of it's very sharp. You don't want to get it in your eyes. And make sure they are safety glasses and not just regular glasses like the readers that I have on now, because these could shatter. Make sure also that you keep the area around the saw clean. This concrete floor, and if it were a wood floor or any floor, it gets very slippery if there is a chunk of material on it or a lot of dust. So when you're making the cuts, you don't want to slip and lose your balance and fall into the blade. Something that's really important, especially for people that are not experienced with a saw, is don't perform anything awkward. So if you're making a cut, if you're building furniture or cabinets or whatever, occasionally you're going to come across something that is a strange cut. Make sure that you know how that cut's going to go from start to finish. And if you start a cut and it feels awkward, you have to stop doing it. Don't continue along. Don't push shut the saw down. Because if anything is awkward, it's going to be dangerous to make that cut. Gotcha. Don't stand in line with the blade. So as we go through this today, I'm going to show you how to make some different cuts, and while we're doing that, I'll show you where your body should be and where your hand position should be as well. Okay. So we'll come back to that when we start making the cuts. This one's important to remember. If you're cutting a board that's less than 6 inches or less, use a push stick rather than your hand, and that will keep your hand safely away from the blade. So anything that's 6 inches or less is going to be with a push stick. Anything that's over 6 inches is going to be with your hand. Because once you start getting over that 6-inch range, the push stick just doesn't have enough control over the material. The push sticks that we use, you can call it a push block or a push stick. The ones that we supply here in the cave are shop made. We make these out of plywood because it's stable, and also if it does get hit, it doesn't really matter. For smaller cuts, these do get cut up a lot. They get sliced from being in contact with the blade. So if you do see one, that I just found this one in the rack, if you see one like this, please put it in the waste bin. Okay. Always push the wood between the blade and the fence. So when you're making a cut, you're holding here and your pressure is here, not on the outside of the blade. If you're pushing on the outside of the blade, you're going to be pushing the material into the blade, and it'll be a dangerous situation. If you are controlling the material between the blade and the fence, then you'll keep the board from kicking back on you. Okay. So you want to make sure that you're always controlling it between the blade and the fence. And also along those same lines is that you want to make sure that you push the material all the way through the cut. I notice a lot of beginners, when they're making a cut, they'll feel the cut stop when it gets to the back of the blade, and they'll stop feeding the material.
Okay.
But you don't want to do that. You want to push all the way, so make sure it's clear of the blade. If that wood is too close to the blade, you run the risk of vibrations and the back of the blade picking up that material and kicking it out.
Okay.
So make sure that you clear that whole material. On this machine, the minimum cut that you can make with this guard in place is 2 inches. And then at that point, you run out of room for the push stick to fit through there. So as we're making the cuts, we're going to make several different size cuts, and I'll show you what to do if this happens, because you can remove this guard easily and replace the splitter and still keep this safe. So, but always keep that in mind, that 2 inches is the minimum that you want to cut with this guard. And I always just test that theory. Whenever I get down low, I always run my push stick through here just to make sure that I'm in the ballpark there and I'm not going to get jammed up, because you don't want to get stuck in the middle of a cut. Never make freehand cuts, ever, ever. Don't just bring something over here without a guide or a miter gauge or the fence and just try to freehand cut it. Yep, because that is a seriously dangerous situation. This saw is not made to be used in that manner. So you definitely want to use the miter gauge or the fence, never freehand. The next thing that I just want to do is go over the parts of the saw, and we'll take a look at what the different adjustments do. Most saws have very similar adjustments, with the exception of maybe how the fence works. But everything else is pretty similar on most table saws. So once you know these parts, although this is a saw stop, so it's got a few extra parts, but on most table saws that you'll come across, they have very similar parts. Starting here, this is the fence. So this is a cam locking T-fence, and it's called a T-fence because it's shaped like a T. And then its cam lock part is, as you push this handle down, it tightens up. So just make sure that when you're using it, that you push the handle all the way down. Yep, and that makes this really solid. One of the things about the T-fence also is that it's much easier to adjust it from back here, because you're just pushing it back and forth, rather than up here, because it locks in place. So you do want to move it back and forth back here, and then just always push that all the way down. Okay. On the bottom of the saw, we've got a couple of handles, two different hand wheels, and they both have locks in the middle of them to keep them in place when they're locked. The one on the front is for raising and lowering the blade. So as you turn that handle, the blade goes up. Let's flip this up. The blade goes up and down. Some people get confused by what that does because of this gauge, the angle gauge, but this actually moves when you move the side handle. So this wheel is for beveling the blade over to make a bevel cut. And as you do that, this entire wheel moves over because it's attached to the motor. So I'm not going to change it now, but that's the side wheel here is for beveling the blade. And that's just for making an angled cut on the edge of your board. When you have your settings to where you want them, just make sure to lock down just screw that all tight. Okay. Before we start messing with the blade, let's always unplug the saw. And I like to drape it over the top just so that I can see that it's unplugged. So you really don't want to touch any of these items without unplugging that. This is the guard. This saw has a pretty nice guard system on it. It has integrated anti-kickback devices right here. So these are spring loaded, and they are there to help prevent a kickback. So as you're pushing through, they raise up. If there were to be a kickback, there are some really sharp points on there, and hopefully they'll help grab the material and keep it from kicking back. Integrated in the guard, the guard is the splitter, and that's part of the same piece. So as you raise and lower the blade or bevel it over, this splitter is going to move with it. Okay. This red part here is called the throat plate or table insert, and this is there to make the hole around the blade as small as possible. This is called a zero clearance insert because there's zero clearance. This piece is interchangeable with some other pieces. For instance, we have a dado blade, which I don't know if you've heard of one of those, but
No.
it's essentially a stack of saw blades that go together to make a wider groove or slot.
Yep.
So if you are to use the dado blade, which as you're developing your furniture skills and cabinet making skills, you're going to use a dado blade.
Okay.
So when you're ready to do that, we'll show you how that
Awesome.
gets set up and how it works. And then that would require a different insert. So, and that's kept with the dado blade. So you are going to want to know how to remove this throat plate and the guard. So the first thing that I do when I remove this is to clip these up out of the way. Because they're spring loaded, when you take this guard off, they will just flip all the way down. So these little clips are easier to, they make it a little easier to remove the guard.
Okay.
To remove this throat plate, I'm just going to pull up this little metal latch and pull this out. Just like that, okay?
Nice.
Something that's really important, on the bottom of this plate, there are these two pins. And when you put the plate back in, they go under these two pins.
Underneath? Okay.
Yep, they just slide right underneath.
Okay.
That's one of the things that you want to check every time you come up to use this saw, because I have noticed many times that when somebody puts it in, they'll put it in improperly so that
It's sticking up.
it's sticking up like that.
Okay.
So whenever I come up to this saw, the first two things that I check for are that this plate is flat, which right now it's not. So we'll just fix that up just like that. And I also check that these anti-kickback devices are down, okay? Because those are two very, very common problems and common things that I notice when I come in to use the saw. So just always check those things. All right. So we're gonna, so those are the basic parts on the outside of the saw. There is also a door here in case you drop the nut down in there from the blade, or if you have to open it to get inside. That door opens up and you just have to push right there to get it open. Okay. The braking mechanism, so the way that this saw stop works is it has a braking mechanism in it. There's a computer and there is an electric pulse running through the blade as it's running, and if something conductive touches that blade, it will fire the brake and shut down it will fire the brake into the blade and drop the blade below the table.
Okay.
So that's a safety feature to help prevent somebody from getting cut or losing a finger. You don't like to test that. We don't like to test it. It has popped a few times in the shop here, mostly one time from a finger. And somebody did not get cut in that instance. And then a couple of times from people using the wrong materials, which were conductive.
Oh, gotcha.
Examples of those conductive materials would be things like aluminum, which you can cut with woodworking with woodworking tools, but because aluminum is conductive, it'll pop this brake.
Okay.
Other things would be wet wood. So if you have wood that's been stored outside and you come to cut it on here, it could very well pop this brake. Another item, we did have a brake pop with somebody that was cutting rigid foam with an aluminum backing on it.
Oh, yep.
Also conductive.
Okay.
so that popped the brake as well. So we've gone through about 5 brakes so far in here.
Oh, wow.
From conductive materials and one finger save, which we're really happy about, the finger save. The conductive materials, not so much. The reason that you would want to know how to change the brake is that when you go to switch over to a dado blade, it requires a different brake.
Okay.
The blade that's on here now is a 10-inch blade. Our dado set is 8 inches in diameter and it's wider. So that braking mechanism has to be a different configuration.
Okay.
So when you go to switch over to the dado, you'll take this brake out and put the other brake in,
Okay.
as well as the throat plate. So if you want to come over on the other side of me, I'll show you how the internals here work. So first of all, we'll pull out this. I'm going to pull this all apart. You're going to put it back together. Okay? So pay attention. So first thing we're going to do is take the insert out and set it aside. And then I'm going to take the guard off. And if you look down inside, there's this big gray handle.
Yep.
So to remove the guard, all you have to do is pull this handle up, and then the guard pops out.
Oh, okay.
When it's in there, there are a couple of pins that go in these holes. So, and that's what holds it in, and just a little bit of pressure. So when you put it back in, you just pop it back in and then wiggle the handle till it and push it all the way down. Okay. So we're just going to pull that out, set it aside. We're going to take the brake or the blade off. You don't want to take the brake out with the blade in place because it's sharp and it's down below, so you will get cut. These wrenches are just hung on the side of the cabinet over there. When you go to take the blade out, you do want to be careful about touching the teeth. On the inside here, there are just 2 flat spots that the wrench hooks around, just like that.
Okay.
And then use the closed end on the other side, and it's a regular threaded nut because of the way the arbor is set up. So then you want to take that nut off, and being careful not to drop it into the saw, and set that aside. And then there's also a washer here.
Okay.
That's a blade stiffener or a washer, and set that aside, and then the blade just slides off. Okay. These are carbide tip blades. You do want to be careful with them. Don't set them on the cast iron. So you want to set them over here, and I usually leave the edge hanging off because if I'm just changing things around. If you're going to change to a different blade, we have a space on the side of the outfeed table over there where that blade can go, and you can put your other blade in. Gotcha. So the braking mechanism is right here, and it's held in with this red key. So to remove this, we're going to take this key out. It just turns up and then pulls out. Okay. And then the brake just slides out, just like that. Gotcha. Okay, so this is the brake. This is held together with a wire inside of here, and there's a really strong piston or spring. And if it senses conductivity, it melts that wire in like 25 milliseconds. The brake pops into the back of the blade, and the blade drops below the table, destroying usually both. Definitely this gets destroyed in that process, and we've only had one blade survive that process. Wow. The others have been toast. So, so we don't want that happening. When this goes back in, it essentially goes on a large pin here, which is right up here. It's really hard to see because it's black. And then that silver pin down there goes in this bottom hole. So it's these 2 holes, and then this center hole, the key goes in that hole. So when that key goes in, it'll be pointed up, and then you click it to go down, and that locks it in place. There's a connection right here. When you slide this in, there's no physical click or anything. It just slides over until it can't go anymore, and then put the key in and lock it in place. Okay. This can be tricky to get in there until you've done it a few times, because you have to align these both at the same time. You can't put one on and then jiggle it onto the other. You kind of have to do both
at the same time before.
Yep, you kind of have to, and they are rounded on the end, so it is, it's not impossible. But it does take some getting used to, especially because you can't see this one. Yeah. But it is right there behind the.
Right underneath that gray handle.
Yep. Okay. Are you confident that you can put this back together?
Let's see.
We'll walk you through it. Yeah, that one takes a little bit of practice to do.
Oh yeah, I see what you mean now.
There you go. Yep, and that starts with the pin pointing up. Yep. It's pretty much straight up. There you go. And then click that all the way down. Yep. And you can do that in either order. You can put the guard in. You can put it in first or second. So when you put the blade in, you want to make sure the teeth are coming over the top. Okay. So turn it around. Yep. You want to make sure that they're coming out of the table, over the top.
That goes on this direction.
Nope. Flip it over. Flat part. Yep. And before you put the nut on, one of the reasons that you don't want to drop the nut is because this is the dust collection chute right here. And so off of the back of this shroud, there's a hose that goes right to that dust collector. So if you drop the nut in there, it's going to either get stuck in the hose, or it's going to end up in the dust collector, or it's going to pop off and end up in the bottom of the saw. So be careful not to drop it.
Out, basically.
Yeah, it's just a hassle. I mean, it's definitely, you can retrieve it. It's just a pain to do. Okay, now when you tighten this up, you don't have to super crank on it.
Okay.
You do want it nice and snug, but if you make it really tight, which some people do, it makes it very difficult to get it off of there.
Okay.
And it makes it dangerous to get it off of there because there are a bunch of sharp teeth here and a bunch of metal.
Yeah, so if it's
So yeah, you're gonna break some knuckles. So you can snug it up pretty good, but you don't have to really crank down. And these are angled, so if you turn this wrench around, if you spin that one around, yep. There you go. Excellent. Here, I'll take those and hang them up. So we're done with those. Excellent. And then put the anti-kickback devices down. Perfect. Okay, great. So that's how you change that out. One of the things that you're going to need to know when you're making cuts is how high to set the blade compared to your material. And let me just grab a piece of wood here. Grab this piece of plywood. So a theory that there are different theories about how high to set the blade. And if you look in a lot of woodworking manuals or instruction books, if there are such a thing, a common idea of where to set the blade is so that just the teeth are sticking out of the material, approximately about 1/4 of an inch. That's really going to depend on what you're cutting. If I have a really good guard in place, I prefer to have the blade up a little bit higher than that. And one of the reasons is that when the blade is very low, there are a lot of teeth in contact and it's creating a lot of friction and a lot of backwards force. If the material is thin and flexible, if the blade is too low, it'll have a real tendency to lift it up. So if you are cutting something thin and you feel it chattering, just raise the blade up a little bit. And don't do that while it's running. Just turn it off, raise it up a little bit, and then start your cut again. But if you do raise the blade up, there are a lot less teeth in contact with the material, so there's less force backwards towards you. Blade manufacturers have a recommended height for their blade. Like these blades are designed to run at a specific height. And my knowledge of that would be that it's just above these. It is just above these, or below. The wood should be set just below these gullies, according to the manufacturer. According to most manufacturers, I obviously haven't read all of them. But it is really going to depend on what you're cutting. One of the theories of having the blade low is that if you do come into contact with it while you're making a cut, you're less likely to cut off an entire digit and maybe just get a cut. Most saws do not have this technology, so as far as the saw stop is concerned, so I don't rely on that mechanism at all. I rely on knowing how to use the saw and not just thinking that, oh, if I hit this, I'm not going to get cut. Because you don't know. We might have a faulty brake. So you do want to pay attention to where the blade is set. Always check it before you start cutting in case somebody before you was cutting a very thin piece of material and they had the blade low. If you start your cut and the blade is too low, you won't be cutting all the way through your material and you'll end up hitting the splitter and you'll be stuck. So the next thing we're going to go over is how to get the machine started up. With the saw stop, there is a startup sequence and there's a special key for starting it up. That's the key. This is kept at the front desk here at the cave. If you need to use the saw, you have to go up and request this key. And when you do that, you'll have to leave your keys in its place so that this doesn't go wandering or get left in the saw. And that way, we also keep track of who's using the saw. Hopefully, we try to. By doing that, it helps. So to start this up, we're going to plug it in. Let's make sure when you plug it in and get things started up, make sure there's nothing near the blade. So on the control panel here, this key goes into this slot right here. So it's got a couple of little ridges on there. When you put this in here, you do want to make sure that it goes in all the way and it's flat. You just don't want it cocked to the side at all. If this gets worn out, we do just print these. We 3D print them. So if you notice that this key is just like flopping around in there, let us know and we'll give you another one.
New one. Okay.
Yep. So when you start this up to turn on the power, you'll power it up and it'll go through a self-diagnostic. And right now the saw is checking the brake and making sure that there are no shorts or anything like that, and making sure that nothing conductive is touching the blade. And so now that that light stopped flashing and it's green, that means we can go ahead and this is the start. You can pull this out to start the machine and then push it to stop it. Okay, and that's the startup sequence. These two lights on here, the green and the red, work in a similar fashion to your engine light on your car.
Oh, yep.
If it does find something wrong, it'll flash a code.
Okay.
And hopefully help figure out why the machine isn't starting if there is something wrong. We've only had that happen once or twice, and it's pretty reliable. So, but those codes are on the wall over there. So,
oh, nice.
So if you notice something there, you can take a look and maybe figure out what's happening. The 1 or 2 times that there was an issue, it was because the blade wasn't, or I'm sorry, the brake wasn't installed properly. And so the remedy was take the brake out, put it back in, and that fixed it. So if anything like that happens, you can just check it out there.
Okay.
All right. So we'll turn that back off for right now. There is a way to test your conductivity, test the material for conductivity, and that would be by, actually let's turn that back on. It's not foolproof. The way to test for conductivity would be to put your material against the blade with your hand on here and see if the red light is flashing. If it were conductive like that, the red light would be flashing. Okay. We have had 1 or 2 instances where the material was tested and several cuts were made, and then all of a sudden the brake went off. And one of them, I'm not sure why it happened. It was a piece of acacia that had a finish on it. There were probably 8 or 10 cuts already made, and then it popped. And when I checked it out with the person who was using it, that last section was definitely conductive. No idea why. And then the other instance was pressure treated lumber. So the outside of the material was pretty dry, but as the cut was made, there was moisture on the inside that migrated to the outside and made the board conductive, and it popped the brake. Okay. Things like nails and screws won't pop this brake because they're not conducting to you. At least in my experience, you can cut through a nail or a screw. So if you're using any reclaimed materials, you always want to check that all the nails and screws are gone, and we have a metal detector for that. You know, like the airport type wand. It's pretty effective. It works for a couple of inches deep, and we've tested it on a lot of boards, and it worked pretty well. So you always want to just check for any materials like that in your wood. If you do, however, hit a screw or a nail, this is what happens to the blade. So all of these teeth where there's an arrow, these are all broken teeth because somebody hit a screw or some nails. And this was a brand new blade. This was only a few days old.
Wow. It's pretty expensive too.
Yeah, so that was destroyed. So you do want to be careful about the material that you're using. So we're going to start by, the next step is we're going to go through some different cuts. And we'll take our time and go through this. I'll show you where to put your body, how to stand, and how to move through the cut. The first cut that we're going to make is wider than what you would need for a push stick. So it's going to be, we'll make about a 10-inch cut with this piece of material. And set this aside. So when you're making these cuts, you really want to, whenever you're using the saw, you want to make sure to keep your work area clear. And so that you don't have things falling off of it, or that things aren't getting in the way as you're trying to reach for things. So you just want to keep everything nice and clean. So when we're making cuts, this is what's happening. You're feeding this way. The blade is pushing back, and the back of the blade coming out of the saw, where it's coming out, is trying to lift the material up. So when that happens, if that were to happen, and this blade and this board were picked up and spun, and that's called a kickback. And that comes off at about 200 miles an hour. So you have zero way of getting out of the way of that. A couple of things that will help prevent that are proper control and also this splitter. That's going to help from the board coming in contact with the back teeth of the blade and spinning out. So your goal while you're making all these cuts is to keep the board tight to the fence. Okay. And I do that by always applying a slight clockwise pressure. And when I'm making my cuts, I watch what's happening at the fence, not the blade, because looking at the blade doesn't tell you where the material is moving. I do look at the blade to make sure that my hands aren't too close to it. But my primary focus is at the fence. And you can see that even if this comes away a little bit with this, especially with this white fence, you can see that it's moving. So your goal is to counteract that and keep this tight to the fence. When you are making cuts, you do need to have at least one straight edge. If this edge were wavy, you can't cut it on the table saw. You would have to straighten that edge first. Okay. We do have a jointer here that is used for straightening an edge. If it's a really wavy board, you can use things like the band saw. You can use a circular saw to straighten it out. But you do have to start with at least one straight edge, and then the saw will cut the other edge parallel to that.
Gotcha.
Okay? So, when we make this cut, let's put this down. I'm going to move this just to the right of the blade. Oops. So when we're making this cut, we don't want to be in line with the material unless it's too big that we have to be in line with it. For smaller cuts, and we're going to be making about a 10-inch cut. For smaller cuts, we're going to want to keep our body just to the left of the blade. And I like to start with my hand, if this piece is manageable enough, with my hand pointed up. And the reason for that is that I have a lot of control over up and down. If I have my hand pointed down, it's a little harder for me to do that, to guide the material. This hand is just guiding along, and I'll often put it right here behind the guard, and it's used to clamp the board that way and down. Okay? So I'm putting pressure on the fence, and I have my thumb here able to push that board down. If this edge is really rough and splintery or sharp, if it has a bevel on it, you may not be able to put your hand against it like that. So you'll have to find a different way to hold that material by using your fingertips. And as you go along, you're going to learn what's comfortable for you. People of different heights use a different hand position than I do. But this is the way that I like to start people off, with this hand up and this hand here. You don't want this hand back too far because that just creates a fulcrum. So you want it on the table, and that makes it nice and solid. Okay? When I'm cutting, I tend to be in contact with the table a lot with my body. So for a board like this, I usually start with my left leg against the saw. And the reason that I like to do that is because it gives me a lot of balance. I'm a lot more solid if I'm touching the saw than if I'm not touching the saw. If it's a longer board, you're not going to start touching the saw. If you're starting back here, it's going to be a longer board. So if you are starting back here, you want to have a good stable stance, and you don't want to take a ton of steps to get up there, a bunch of mini steps. So I like to know that, okay, I'm going to take 1 step, 2 steps, and I'm here. And I'm back in that same position. So I start with my left leg against the saw. As I push through, I'm watching the fence. And when I get up to the table, now I'm gonna clamp down with this left hand and flip this hand over. Okay? And when I do that, I always want to have a hook on the back of the board, whether it's my palm or my thumb. I always want to have a hook there and not putting my hand on top, because a lot of these materials are very slippery. And if you slip, you could very easily lose control of the material. So again, I'll start left leg here, start with this hand. I like to point my fingers back because I don't like them pointing at the blade. So I point my fingers back just like that. And so that hand is against the material with my thumb on top. This hand is controlling this. I'll push forward. Once I get up to here, I'll clamp down, flip this hand over, and then I turn my whole body. So now that my right leg is against the saw. And then I typically will put this hand down here unless it's guiding the material. And the reason that I do that, the reason that I do both of these things is for reach. Because I'm reaching like this, and then I'm reaching like this. So I start with my left forward and my right hand back, and then I turn so that my right hand can reach forward. If I'm like this, I can't really reach up there.
Yeah.
Okay? So that whole motion looks just like this. Turn, and then push all the way through. Okay? And this whole time, this hand is creating that slight twist to the material and keeping it against the fence. Okay? And believe it or not, this is much easier to do when you're making a cut than when you're just freehanding through here. The saw is connected to that dust collector, and this collector runs the jointer and the table saw. So there are gates, and you just want to check and make sure that the table saw gate is open and that this gate is closed. Like I mentioned before, that chute is right under the blade. So if you don't run the dust collector, that's going to fill up right away and clog. So make sure, even if you only have 1 or 2 cuts, turn on the dust collector. And the button for it is right here on the front. There's an on button and an off button. All right, and then this is where you're going to need your hearing protection, and I'll put on some safety glasses here, get rid of this. I like to use earplugs.
Yeah, those are better.
Yeah. Which, if you are in here, we do have earplugs up at the front. They're like 50 cents a set. And you're welcome to bring your own hearing protection as well. All right, so I'm gonna adjust the fence. There is a tape measure here, so you can put, there's a marker right here, so you can slide that over. We're gonna do 10 inches, okay? And then lock that down. So now that indicates how big that piece is gonna be after we cut it. All right, so when I turn on the material, on the machine, I wanna make sure nothing's in the way, and I'll just pull that up, okay? And then I'm gonna make my cut. Okay? And that's all there is to that. Okay, so if you want to adjust that a little bit smaller, just like 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch. And then go ahead and turn on the machine. Yep. Okay, and when you are cutting, your thumb was kind of out there. You want to make sure that you're not getting too close to the blade, and I wouldn't get any closer than about 3 or 4 inches. So in this case, I like to keep my thumb like this rather than this. Also, if space allows, I tend to not get my hand too tight to the fence, because then you don't have any control over that material. Okay. Gotcha. So just keep an eye on that.
Pretty good.
Okay, so we're going to make the same cut again, except we're going to use the push stick.
Okay.
So now we're going to get down to 6 inches. Except I'm going to start over there. When I'm using a push stick like this one, I like to put it right here so that when I need it, I can just pick it right up. Yep, I just put it right back like that with the bottom facing this way so that I can just easily grab the top. I do have a bad habit, and always have, of setting this down right here. I'll make my cut, push through, and set that right there. I've been doing it for years. I've been getting better at it. When I do that, I make sure that before my next cut, I just move it down here. So that it's, so that it's right where I need it when I need it. So this cut is going to look exactly like the one we just did, except we're going to incorporate the push stick. So I'm going to make my cut. When I get up to the table here, instead of putting my hand over, I'm going to pick up the push stick. And I'm going to put it out here, not way over here. I mean, it's going to be a 6-inch cut, so it'll be a little bit smaller than this. But I like it out away from the fence so that I do have some lateral control. All right, and then I'm going to push through, just like we did before. Exactly the same. Okay, so I'm going to go down to 6 inches. Put my push stick in place. Turn on my dust collector. And I like to leave the material sitting there while I start the saw. Something that you definitely want to know about is when you're making a cut, you want to keep control of that material the whole time, even if something goes wrong. Some things that could go wrong are a splinter could fly off of the board, hit you in the face. Don't let go of the material. Don't do this. I've had splinters fly off and hit me in the hand. Just make sure you maintain control all the way through the cut. Another thing that could happen a lot of times when you're cutting solid wood, it will bow or pinch the blade. Sometimes you'll get jammed or you just get into a tricky situation. With this paddle switch, you can actually reach your foot up and shut that off. So if you do get into a weird spot, you can hit it with your knee, you can hit it with your foot. If you're too far back, there are always people in the shop, just call for help to have somebody shut it off. You just don't let go of that material because we don't want it coming out.
Flying back.
When you have to make a cut that's smaller than 2 inches, which we've only gotten down to 6 inches, we're going to switch out the guard. And we don't actually have to make this cut. I'm just going to show you what to do. So same operation, removing the guard. Just going to pull this guard out. And then down below here is a riving knife. So this replaces that splitter. And you can put that in there, lock that in. And now you can make those smaller cuts. You can also, this knife is below the top of this blade. So you could also make a cut that doesn't go all the way through the board with this in place. So you either want to have this in place or this in place when you're making cuts. With the dado blade, it's different. You won't have either of them in. So that just lives down there. If you do take this out, don't leave it here while you're cutting it. While you're cutting, you can put it down below in one of those slots or put it over on a cart if there is one. So we're just going to pop that down there, right like that. And then this will go back in. And we put it in, we're going to make sure it's flush. And kick back the braces down. Okay. So the next cut that we're going to make is a wider board. Let me get these out of here. We'll cut a panel that's a little bit wider, and in this case we are going to have to be entirely on this side of the saw of the blade. Luckily we have 2 hands to control the material now as we're guiding through, so we're able to help get decent control on that material so that it's not going to come back at us. Let me just find a panel that we can do that with, which will be, let's do this one. So for this panel, we're going to be entirely on this side of the blade. And let me just get this set up. Let's go about there. So when I cut a panel like this, I like to start by putting that front corner against the fence and then just straightening it out. And then my hands are down now rather than up. And that's a personal preference as well. What this allows me to do is a lot of times when I get a larger panel like this, it'll have some flex to it. So this allows me to control it. If I were cutting a piece of 1/4 inch plywood and I'm back pretty far, it's going to be shaped like this because it's flexible. So this, having my hands pointed down and my thumbs clipped around, allows me to control that material through the saw. Much like before, I want to have a good solid stance, and it's really all about just walking your material through there, keeping an eye on what's happening on the fence, make sure that your board's not coming away. I am pretty much just watching the fence. I've got peripheral vision, seeing what's happening over here. When I get up close to the table, I'm going to make sure that this hand is in a good position. I don't want it too close to the blade, obviously. So I'm going to move it over. I don't want to be all the way over here because, again, I won't have any control over that happening. So I'll just make sure that this hand is in a good position, and I'll continue through my cut. And the same, I'm going to always keep a hook on the back, whether it's my thumbs or my palms. I'm always going to keep control of that so that I don't want, especially on something like melamine, I don't want my hands on top because this is really slippery. So I don't want to lose control of the material, and then I'll just push all the way through. Okay. So let's get this cut going. So now, when you're cutting over here and you get a small cutoff piece, and it's stuck in there, don't bend down to turn this off, because you don't want that piece coming out and hitting you in the chest or in the face. So you can just kick that off, let the blade wind down, and then remove that extra piece. Okay. And I always, like I mentioned before, I like to just leave the pieces there until I get everything set, the saw running, then pick up the material. Oh, let me get my safety gear. And dust collector. Okay, so I'll start with that corner. My hands are pointed down, clipped around, and I'm just going to walk through the cut. I'm watching the fence, and I'm making sure that this hand is in a good spot. And I'm just going to push through. Now I have that piece in there, so I'm just going to kick that off, let the blade stop running, and then I'll remove that piece. Okay, pretty comfortable with that?
Yeah, that was good.
Okay.
Felt good.
So something else. So those are some basic cuts. You'll come across a lot of different cuts.
Okay.
And having these basics will help you figure out those other cuts. One of the things that we do need to talk about, a couple more things to talk about. Once the panels or boards start getting wide this way and narrow this way, it becomes more and more difficult to control them through the cut.
Yeah.
So if a board becomes too narrow, and I don't know any real formula for that, as far as length times width. But once they do start getting narrow and hard to control, I find a different way to cut them. So we have the sliding miter saw, we have an auxiliary cutoff table that you can use a circular saw with. And we also have down there a sliding table, a sliding sled, cutoff sled for this, which works as a large miter gauge. And I'll show you that a little bit later. But you definitely want to be careful of this piece getting narrow, because you want as much surface on this fence so that you can control the board as possible.
Keep kicking back.
Yep, and I've definitely seen some people do very, very dangerous, scary things by wanting to cut a 2x4, cut that off. Between. Don't do that. Don't do that. Make sure that you're really going to be able to control that material through the whole cut. We do have a miter gauge. So this is called a miter head or a miter gauge. So that runs in these slots, and you can actually make cutoffs with it, or lots of different types of joinery, tenons or box joints. So you can use this for a lot of different things. If you're using this to make cutoffs, excuse me, you don't want to use it in conjunction with the fence. Because if I were to cut that piece off, now once this is cut off, it's jammed in there and it's going to kick. So you don't ever want to do that. So you can move the fence away and make a cutoff like that. The other option is to add an auxiliary stop on here. Let me see if I've got one. It could be something like this. You can make a stop like this, a fence like this, and attach it to this fence as long as it's behind the blade. So if I were to use this piece, I mean, this is not such a great example because of the way it's put together. But if I were to use this as my stop, then I could make repeat cuts of the same size. And once that is cut off, then there's a lot of space in here and it's not going to get jammed. Just make sure that that's well behind the blade. Okay. So when you come in to use the table saw, since we went through this, we're going to fill out the certification form. That'll get added to your profile at the front desk, and you'll just check in there. They'll be able to see that you've been certified on the table saw.
Okay.
So you can come in and work on your projects whenever you want. Really appreciate everybody checking out this video. This is a basic safety and instruction course on using the table saw. Not by no means an expert on this. I've been doing it for a long time and have found out methods that I feel safe using. Feel free to let us know if you have better ideas about it or other ideas about it. And hope to see you at the cave. Thanks.